Welcome again to the course Life of Christ. We're now in class 5. We're continuing our geographical tour of some of the places that were important in Jesus' ministry. In the last video, we looked at Judea and parts of Samaria with some of the towns and villages where Jesus was. In this video, we want to focus on Jerusalem, one of the most important cities in the world for several faiths of different people, and of course, in the ministry of Jesus. So let's go ahead and share the PowerPoint here and begin to look at some of these places. First of all, we have a timeline of Jerusalem. I want to mention and share with you, let me switch over to that really fast, a timeline that was done by Dr. Bill Umble. He was a professor of Bible and archaeology and history at Abilene Christian for a number of years, Abilene Christian University. He has spent many summers in archaeology and also leading trips to Israel. And he put together this timeline of Jerusalem, not only in the time of Jesus, but beginning way before that, 2600 before Christ, or before Common Era, as the BCE stands for. And then it goes on down through the time of Abraham and then on through. And we're going to track some of the major people and events that we know about from the Bible of Jerusalem as we go through this. But if you look in your resources on the webpage, you can download this timeline and study some of the important events, and it's got the dates, obviously, all the way to the left, different battles that were fought there through the years, the fall of Jerusalem to where the southern kingdom of Judah went off to exile, down to the time of Jesus and Herod the Great, that time, Jesus' ministry there in that city over his 3-year ministry, and then the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem again in 70 AD. And then from then on, it's a story of many different nations coming through and trying to conquer it. The Crusades, several of them raged back and forth over Jerusalem and the Holy Lands. And then after that, other nations began to take over. The Ottoman Empire was important, the Turks, different famous rulers. And then finally, in 1918, the end of World War I, and then later on in the century, in 1948, when Israel declared itself a nation again and began the modern nation of Israel, kind of being resurrected from the dead after almost 2,000 years. And then the last date on this particular timeline is June of 67, which was the Six-Day War in which the Jews took back Jerusalem and began to worship again in different parts of the city. Since then, of course, there's been a lot more go on. As this video is recorded, it's been 52 more years since 1967, and it's interesting to see how the history of Israel as a nation has developed then. So I recommend that timeline to you. Hope that you can benefit from that. Now let's go back to the PowerPoint. And again, as we said, it follows the timeline there. The first story that we hear about that mentions what became Jerusalem is the story of Abraham and Melchizedek in Genesis chapter 14. That's a very interesting story if you want to go back and read it. It actually is not just that story, but it has connections to other parts of the Old Testament, other major events. The location where that story took place was a location where events repeatedly occurred in biblical history, and perhaps even the end of history with the final judgment could occur somewhere right around that same area where Abraham and Melchizedek met. And again, that's one of those things that could be, not 100% sure, but it's a possibility. And so if you want to look at that story in Genesis 14, you see that as Abraham comes back from rescuing Lot, then he meets Melchizedek, and he is able to be blessed by Melchizedek, and Melchizedek brings him bread and wine. Abraham gives him a tithe, and then Abraham goes on his way. At that time, the city was called Salem, which means peace. And so you have the interesting names here connected to this story, where you have the king of righteousness, Melchizedek, who comes out of the city of Salem. He's the king of the city of peace. And again, you have these connections with Jesus. Later on in Hebrews chapter 7, you see that Jesus and Melchizedek are compared as types, the same kind of ministry. And so, again, I recommend to you that story. to do some background work on it. I think you'll be interested. The next time we see Jerusalem in the Bible jumps all the way down to the time of the conquest with Joshua. And when he goes and he's conquering the land of Canaan, then he comes to the city of Jebus, which is the same place, but now with a different name. And so the Adoni-Zedek, the king of that city at that time, comes out and tries to confront Joshua. And of course, he loses to Joshua. So Joshua actually conquers this city as well. Now, again, the names are striking here. One, the name of Joshua is very similar to Jesus' name in Hebrew, Yeshua. It's the same roots, salvation. And so you have salvation coming up to the city that would be Jerusalem. And the king of that is named Adoni, which means Lord, and Zedek, which means righteousness. So you have salvation coming up to the city of Jerusalem, and the Lord of righteousness comes out to meet him. And again, you think about, Jesus coming later as the true Lord that brings righteousness, and that king goes into the city in the triumphal entry and declares, his ministry, and then finishes that ministry on the cross and then raising from the dead. So again, the names and events, they all overlap and connect. I recommend that you go study the backgrounds of this one as well. Then after that, the next time we see Jebus is during the time of David. Now quite a time has passed, at least a couple of hundred years by most calendars. And David becomes king of Hebron, the southern section of the area after Saul has passed away. But he doesn't yet control the whole country. Some of the other parts that were loyal to Saul haven't come to him yet. And so one of the things that David does to establish his kingship is to come and establish a new capital, a spiritual capital, geographical capital that was further north than Hebron, but further south than Gibeah, where Saul had his palace. And so he takes the city of Jebus with Joab and his men, and it was a small city at that time, maybe something like 2 blocks by 6 blocks, as we might measure it, not the big city that came to be later on. And you look at this picture, which is one of the ones found in the museum of the city of David there, and you see it's just tiny. It's kind of on a hill. Down at this end of it, on the eastern side of it, you have what they call the water gate later on. You have a spring, the spring of Gihon, and it runs down into a pool, and that's the water source for Jerusalem. That source is still running today. In fact, it's still the only freshwater source that's naturally occurring in that area. Jerusalem's not built on a lake, not built on a sea, nothing like that. There's no river that goes by it. It's this spring. And so that was all the way back to the time of David, which is one of the reasons there was a city here, the source of water. Then David took it over and would have made his capital probably up here on the top end, up the hill on the Acropolis, probably built his palace there, likely moved the Ark of the Covenant when he brought that in 2 Samuel 6 and 7. When he brought that in, he probably put it near his palace at the top of the city. And that was Jerusalem then in the time of David, the city of Zion, the city of David, several names there. Then during the time, let me go back one here, during the time of Solomon, the city was expanded more. There were more houses outside these walls. And then Solomon took this upper hill up here, which is kind of the top of one of the mountains there, part of the location of Mount Moriah. And Solomon used this higher elevation to build his temple that David had helped prepare for. And so Solomon builds it there. The city extends up to envelop the Temple Mount, and that was Jerusalem in the time of Solomon. Bigger than the time of David, but not strikingly so. And then as the United Kingdom continues, and then the divided kingdom begins, Jerusalem is still an important city, the capital of Judah, the southern kingdom. And so then history goes on. Then finally, Jerusalem is destroyed, and the temple is destroyed in 586 BC. Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians take many of the Israelites off into Babylon into captivity. And it's only 70 years later that people begin to come back from the Babylonian captivity and begin to resettle Jerusalem and the areas around Jerusalem, some of the small villages in Judea. Now, there were three groups that came back from the exile. The first group came back to rebuild the temple and the altar. The second group came back with Ezra, again, to continue to reestablish the temple service and following the law and just resettling part of Israel. And then the third group came back with Nehemiah. And this picture shows you Jerusalem in the time of Nehemiah, when the pink area here is what Jerusalem looked like. Now, the Temple Mount wasn't this big. It was just more like the top of a mountain. And when they rebuilt the temple, then they rebuilt it where the Temple of Solomon was. It wasn't as glorious or grand as that temple, according to what we read, but it was rebuilt so they could reestablish worship. And then Nehemiah's mission with the people was to govern the city and then rebuild the walls that were all torn down from the previous conquest. And so you see Nehemiah here would build these walls. And if you look around, you see different towers at the corners. You see the different gates, the Valley Gate, the Dung Gate, etc. The Pool of Siloam, that's one of the water sources. Here's the Gihon Spring that I mentioned before. And you keep on going around the city and see different gates. And so when they did the rebuilding, Nehemiah would assign teams of different builders, and they would build a certain gate and then the wall to the next gate. Then the next group would take over. And they say they built the wall again in 52 days, which is pretty impressive, especially considering the problems they had internally and externally with the people trying to discourage them from building the walls. So this is Jerusalem in the time of Nehemiah. Now you may ask, what is the green border here that we see? And basically, just to give a reference, this is the borders of the old city today in Jerusalem, kind of a quadrangle, but obviously the walls are not straight. But you see how the old city from today would overlay the city of Jerusalem in Nehemiah's time. Then if you move more toward the time of Jesus, this is a pretty good artist rendering of what they think Jerusalem looked like during Jesus' ministry. This is just after Herod the Great had rebuilt part of the temple or remodeled it, expanded the Temple Mount. People who saw that said, if you haven't seen Herod the Great's temple, you haven't seen anything that's beautiful. And so it's pretty impressive. It dominates the skyline of Jerusalem at Jesus' time. All of this here is the Temple Mount complex. Here's the temple itself that Herod rebuilt in the middle, and then all the temple courts, or where a lot of the teaching took place, and where all the selling of animals and doves and pigeons and everything we read about, that all took place. This is the upper city up this area, the lower city right through here, the business districts over here, Herod's palace here, and we're going to look at some more of these. But this is actually a picture taken of an artist's rendering of Jerusalem at this time that's now in the Museum of David in the city of David. So you can go down there and look at it. If you go to a different area of the city, to the Israel Museum, they have a whole area, about 1/4 of an acre, devoted to a model of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. Really, actually, the exact date was 66 AD, about 30 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. And this is a mosaic on one of the walls at that model that shows you Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. Now, this map is oriented like a lot of maps are back in those times, where east is up, right? Normally north is up for us. East is at the top of this map. And so then you look from there and you have north over to the left, and then you have south to the right, and then you have west down, pointing down, okay? And so you see on this particular map, you see the Temple Mount right here, kind of a rectangle, and there's the temple in the middle. You see the city of David right here. You see Herod's palace over here with some of the towers from it. You see some of the business district up here. You see the Fortress Antonia, where different Roman governors and procurators, maybe including Pilate, lived and ruled, and where some of the soldiers were. So Jerusalem at the time of the Second Temple, called that because that's the temple that Herod helped rebuild there after in that time of Jesus. Now, here's the actual model. If you go to the Israel Museum, and where we're standing, we're looking at the model from the eastern side, okay? So it's as if we were standing on the Mount of Olives and overlooking Jerusalem. This is a panoramic view that get you just about all the model there. Okay, so you see again the Temple Mount dominating the skyline with the temple in the middle. This little area right here, the Antonia Fortress with the 4 towers. Then you have over here to the left going down the hill, the original city of David. Now, if you remember the picture of the city of David, this is what it is right here. It's just this little section right here. And you see how Jerusalem had grown by the time of Jesus, okay? Then you have the upper city where the more wealthy people lived, the Sadducees, probably the high priest lived as well. Then you have over here to the right some of the business district. This is what it looked like. Now, if we go a little bit more detail, we kind of focus on the different areas of the city. We see again standing on the Mount of Olives, as it were, looking at the temple here in the middle in the morning sun. You see the courts of the temple where Jesus was, where Peter and the apostles preached in Acts, where healings took place, rabbis taught, including Jesus. And then just in front of us in the Kidron Valley that runs along the eastern side of Jerusalem. Then you have over here, you can't see it very well here, but it's the Antonia Fortress with its 4 towers there. You see them a little bit better from the west now in this picture, Antonia Fortress, and perhaps this is where Jesus was tried before Pilate and scourged and sent out to die. If that's the case, if that's where he was, and he would have been inside here in the courtyard, come out these doors here, down these steps, then come out over here through this gate, because we know that Calvary was outside the city wall, and it was near a gate of the city and near a garden with a tomb in it. So we have here those elements. Here's the wall and the gates, and they think that Golgotha or Calvary might have been right there outside the wall. At that time, at the time of Jesus, it would have been outside the wall. Then if you go a little bit further west, just to kind of orient us, we were just over here behind the temple. Okay, now we're looking from the southwest about. Here's the Antonia Fortress we just mentioned. Right about over here is Golgotha we just mentioned. So if you come further south and further west, this whole western part of Jerusalem at that time was dominated by Herod's palace, Herod the Great's palace. And it wasn't just for him, it was for his guests. And also, as the Romans began to rule, it was for the Romans rulers to come here as well. So it's likely that Pilate lived here and maybe held court here as well, another possible location for the trial of Jesus. Herod, not Herod the Great, but his son, who tried Jesus as part of his trial, he probably lived here as well. And many other guests would have come. A beautiful place, fountains and plants and trees, a lot of room for guests, one of the show places of the city. The Pool of Bethesda was a little bit down to the north, I believe, and we see that mentioned in John 5. And then you see to the eastern part of Jerusalem, across the Kidron Valley, the Mount of Olives, and we've already been standing on that. We see it from an aerial view here. We see the whole mount is really actually a series of like 4 little peaks. It's not very high, maybe 2,400 feet high or so. And some of these are areas where events of the Bible happened. And according to Zechariah, the Mount of Olives will split in the future, and like the southern and northern parts will kind of pull away from each other. And again, we don't know about how to understand all that, if that's metaphors, if that's literal, how that prophecy works out. But if you look at the context here, the Mount of Olives here, and then just over the mount, you have Bethany right here, where Jesus stayed with Mary and Martha and Lazarus, probably the last week here. Then if you go over here, you're to the northern part, you have Gibeah there. And so you kind of see how big Jerusalem is now, about 800,000 people. Now, if you zoom in just a little bit, we're still coming in from our helicopter, as it were, and zooming in on the city. Now we see Bethany, which we saw before. We see Bethphage, which is mentioned in the story of the triumphal entry in Matthew 21. We see the Russian Church of the Ascension, which marks one of the possible spots that Jesus ascended from. Then we see a modern-day hotel on top of the actual Mount of Olives right here. All of this along here is the Mount. We see the Jewish cemetery that's been there for hundreds of years as well. And then we cross the Kidron Valley right here, and then go over to the Temple Mount, and you see the Golden Dome, the famous Golden Dome of the Mosque of Omar, that's been there since 692 AD. Then you see the rest of Jerusalem, the rest of the Old City, the place where Jesus may have been crucified out here to the west, now inside of a church of the Holy Sepulchre. Okay. If you go a little bit closer even, then you see the same cemetery, the same hotel, the Kidron Valley, the Temple Mount, and Church of All Nations here in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Temple Mount over here with the Dome of the Rock. And then just an interesting cultural thing, some Jews who are coming to pay respects to a family member or friend that died. It's a common custom to come visit the tombs on certain occasions and to reflect on how important that person was in their lives and how they build on the life of that person and their own lives. And so we see several Jews here in their outfits, you know, the typical traditional Orthodox Jewish garb there. And then if you look at the Mount of Olives, a little bit different perspectives from the northeast, you see again part of the cemetery that's down here below us, okay? You see part of the Garden of Gethsemane along here. You see the Church of All Nations right here, the cemetery over on this end, and then you have other churches of different kinds along this side of the Mount of Olives. We'll see some of those later on. Now let's switch off of this, and if I can show you just briefly here, go to one or two of our other videos. Okay, now you should be looking at our 360 video that we have of the Mount of Olives, taken from the Mount of Olives. And it's actually was kind of a bright day, and so you may or may not be able to see this very clearly, but we're standing on the Mount of Olives at one of the vantage points, looking over into the Temple Mount. And so actually, you can kind of look around here, get the perspectives. There's always a lot of people around there. My friend Brent that does some of these videos, if you want to listen to them. On down this direction, you see the Garden of Gethsemane right over here. You see right through here the Kidron Valley that we mentioned. And again, sorry, it's so bright. And then right over here, the Temple Mount. And then down further to the south, you see the city of David. Okay, and then if you keep on going around, there I am trying to talk about that. And then part of the cemetery right here. And then there's always places for tourists to come and take pictures, and also to have short devos. That's a pretty meaningful thing, to sit in this place and to see what, you know, to look at Jerusalem and think about all the things that happened right here. Let me mention also a different video, again from the Above Israel series from the helicopters. Again, I can't show it to you, but I can recommend that if you have those, or if you can borrow them from somebody, then you can look at the Jerusalem DVD and look at video number 1 about the Mount of Olives, also video number 7 about Bethany that we already saw some pictures of. All right, let me jump back over if I can. In fact, I'm going to actually do this just a little bit out of order since we're already over here. I'm going to look at one other 360 video. Let me look at that here. Okay, this particular video here. Yes. Okay, now we are standing to the south of the Temple Mount on the southern steps. And this is one of the possible locations for Peter's address at Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. And so we're actually standing on the southern steps. Let me kind of get back out here on that. Okay, let me get out of that real quickly and come back into it.
Standing here on the
yes, we are.
southern step.
Okay, so let me see if I can zoom a little bit differently here. Yeah, it's not doing it. So anyway, this is another one of those videos that can be very helpful for you as you study more of how things are fit together. In that particular video, you'll see the city of David down to the south. Then if you turn around directly from that, then you'll see the southern part of the steps and also the Temple Mount. So again, I recommend that you go find these videos, 360 videos, and then also that you also find the Above Israel videos. Now, let me go back here and trade out. Let me stop sharing that and go back to see if we can show you some more facts about the temple itself, because I showed you the book the other day that had to do with the building of a temple model, and I told you there's a man in England that actually had built his own model. He actually built it in his own backyard. And so here are some of the facts about this man. His name is Alec Gerard. He's now over 80. He spent a long time doing this. He's actually from Norfolk, England. And it says it took him 33,000 hours over 30 years. I can't quite imagine how long that would take. Don't know how many hours there are in a year, but that's a lot of hours. And then if you go on down, you see that it was in his backyard. And in fact, some of the world's leading scholars have gone to this guy's backyard and looked at the model and concluded it's probably the most accurate model of the temple in Jesus' time in the world. So again, if you have a chance to go see that, that would be interesting. 20 feet by 12 feet, so it's a scale of 1 to 100. And this man hand-baked and painted every single brick and tile. He made all the figures, and then he painted the figures, 4,000 figures that are a ½ inch tall, and even painted the costumes correctly that they would have used back in those days. He says he put 32 different versions of Jesus in the model, and one of the things he likes to do is to ask people if they can pick out which figures are Jesus out of the 4,000, and he says they rarely get it right. Interesting to have so many versions of Jesus there. And as I mentioned, the experts think it's probably one of the best models in the world, if not the best in the whole world. So here's some pictures of it. This is Alec Gerard in the background, with the background there of, if he's from this perspective here, we're looking from the east again onto the middle of the temple. You see the temple itself in the middle here. Then you see the different courts around the temple and before the temple. You see the other courts of the Gentiles, where other activities happened all around here. See just a little bit different perspective there. Some of these 4 areas that were different elements they used in temple sacrifice and worship were restored. Changing the angle just a little bit, kind of looking at it now from the southeast corner, you see some of these figures that we mentioned, the 4,000 Jews that were coming up from the south, coming into the temple area and going into the area of the sacrifice and the area of prayer, the court of the women, or the court of prayer here. This is what that area is. So this is one of the reasons it was called the court of the women, is because they could actually be in this area. This is as far as they could go. Only the men could go through this big door here into the area of the sacrifices where all those took place. And of course, only the priest could go into the temple and the high priest into the most holy place. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this court of the women is that these menorahs that were used at different times of the year, particularly during the Feast of Tabernacles, and we'll talk more about those later on in the course. But just to give you an idea of the scale of these big menorahs, these huge candlesticks, you see a priest lighting some of them above, and this is not perhaps exactly like they look, but gives you a good idea about it. Again, just huge. And then here it's as if you're standing in the court of the women, looking up into the court of sacrifice and seeing the veil that leads into the holy place. Then you have just an area of the court. Again, this is where the selling of the animals would have taken place, the money changing, also where the Gentiles could come in legally and worship God, as God promised they would be able to do in Isaiah 56. Just some of the areas at the ends or the edges of the Temple Mount complex. It was common for rabbis to bring their students to these areas and sit down and teach, or walk along here and teach. And it's likely that Jesus did that too during his ministry. And then you have the city of David, which is now outside the temple to the south. The Southern Steps video that we showed you, or tried to show you, was right from these steps here on the southern part of the temple. And they looked down over the original city of David, which was just this part right here. That's all the city of David was when David first conquered it. Again, very small place. And then over to the right here, the Kidron Valley. Over to the left, then the lower city. And of course, you see the temple there as well. Okay, we tried to show you that video, and kind of the zoom messed up on that one. Again, if you can get the videos about above Israel, then for Jerusalem, there are a great number of videos, and I recommend all of these in particular to see different parts of the city and learn about it from above. Again, we have the resources that are mentioned that we've used in this video and that we'll use in others as well, and hope that these resources can deepen your knowledge and your interest in what we studied. Hope that this class has been helpful for you. I've enjoyed talking about Jerusalem. It's a great place to go and to visit. I've enjoyed studying it for hundreds of hours over the last several years, and I recommend the same thing. I think you'll really benefit from it in your study. We'll see you next time in class. God bless you.